The letter hit the floor of the Ford ranch house like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples it sent through Charlotte Brooks's chest nearly stopped her heart entirely. She had not meant to read it. She had been reaching for the bottle of laudanum on the bedside table, her fingers steady as they always were even in moments of crisis, even when the world was cracking apart beneath her feet. Old Harlan Ford was sleeping fitfully in the bed beside her, his breath rattling through his chest like a wagon wheel over loose gravel, and the letter had simply fallen from between the pages of the Bible she'd moved to reach the medicine. It had fallen open, face up, as though it had always intended for her to see it. The handwriting was Cecil's. She knew it by now after 6 weeks on this ranch. Strong, slanted letters pressed hard into the page as though he needed the words to last beyond him. She should not have read it, but she had. And now she understood everything. The cold silence at the supper table, the way his eyes tracked her across the yard when he thought she wasn't looking, the nights she had heard him pacing the floorboards above her room until the small hours of the morning. She understood the secrets he had been carrying since before she arrived, and she understood with a cold, terrible clarity that she had been lied to from the very beginning. The letter was addressed to a man in Abilene named Prentice Doyle. It read, "The arrangement we discussed is no longer something I can guarantee. The nurse has complicated matters considerably. I am telling you now so you understand. If you move on this before I say otherwise, I will consider it a betrayal, and you know what I do with betrayals. Do not come to Caldwell. Not yet." Charlotte's hand was trembling when she set the letter back where it had fallen. Her mouth was dry. Outside, she could hear Cecil's boots on the porch, the slow, measured tread of a man who had trained himself never to move in haste, never to let anyone see what was running through him. She straightened her apron. She checked Harlan's pulse. She arranged her expression into something that would not betray the storm inside her. The door opened, and Cecil Ford stepped in from the Kansas evening light, his silhouette filling the doorframe in that way that had unsettled her from the very first day. Their eyes met across his father's bed, across the fragile, sleeping body of the man who had brought them both to this crossroads. And Charlotte understood with absolute certainty that nothing between them would ever be simple again. 6 weeks earlier, the world had looked considerably more straightforward. Charlotte Brooks had arrived in Caldwell, Kansas on the 4th of September in 1878, aboard a train that smelled of coal smoke and cattle, and the particular desperation of people traveling towards something they were not certain would receive them. She was 26 years old, a trained nurse who had studied under Dr. Emmett Hale in St. Louis for 3 years before taking a position with the Kansas Territorial Nursing Society, which was a fancier name than the organization truly deserved for what it actually did, which was match skilled medical women with frontier families who had no access to doctors and no money to pay full physician fees. The society had matched Charlotte with Harlan Ford of Caldwell, proprietor of the Double Arrow Ranch, age 64, suffering from a condition the local barber surgeon had described in the telegram as chest ailment of worsening severity, occasional fits, weakness in the extremities, possible rheumatic complications. The assignment was meant to last 8 weeks. Charlotte had taken it because the previous one, a miner's family outside Dodge City, had ended in the kind of grief that required distance and new purpose to survive. She had not been told, in the matching letter, that Harlan Ford had a son. This was, in retrospect, the kind of omission that changed the entire shape of a story. Cecil Ford was 30 years old when Charlotte first laid eyes on him, and he was standing in the yard of the Double Arrow Ranch holding a horse by the bridle with one hand and a length of fence post in the other, his dark hair damp with afternoon sweat, and his expression carrying the particular wariness of a man who has learned that most arrivals bring trouble. He was tall in the way that men who have worked outdoors their whole lives are tall not for vanity, but because hard work stretches you upward and draws you lean, and makes you look as though the land itself had something to do with your construction. His eyes were the color of the Kansas sky in October, a gray-blue that couldn't quite settle on what it wanted to be. He looked at Charlotte stepping down from the hired buckboard with her leather medical bag and her single traveling trunk, and his expression shifted through something she could not immediately identify. It wasn't hostility, precisely. It wasn't welcome either. It was something more complicated than either of those things, something that lived in the space between a man's intentions and the reality that life keeps sending him. "You must be Miss Brooks," he said. He did not move toward her. He set the fence post down, and he came closer by measured degrees, the horse following him placidly, as though the animal trusted his pace precisely because he never changed it. "Charlotte Brooks," she confirmed, because she had always believed that first names stated plainly were a kind of declaration, that she was here to work, not to disappear into a title. "I was told your father needed nursing." "He does." Cecil's jaw moved. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come. These arrangements fall through more often than they hold." "I came," Charlotte said simply. Something moved across his face. She would spend the next 6 weeks trying to name it accurately. The closest she ever got was this. It looked like a man recognizing something he had not expected to need. He showed her into the house. The Double Arrow Ranch house was built solid and low against the Kansas wind, with thick timber walls and deep-set windows, and a front room that spoke of a woman's touches gone several years absent, curtains that had faded past their original color. A quilt folded on the settee that had been washed so many times its pattern was more memory than image. There was a large stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 6 chairs, and a sideboard holding a row of canned goods and 2 oil lamps. It was a house that had been carefully maintained by someone who did not entirely believe in comfort for its own sake, but who understood that a clean and ordered home was a different kind of discipline. "My father's room is through here," Cecil said, leading her down the narrow hall. Harlan Ford was propped against pillows in a room that faced east to catch the morning light, and he looked up when Charlotte entered with eyes that were dark and sharp, and entirely unlike his son's. Where Cecil's gaze was cautious and measuring, Harlan's was direct and entirely unguarded, the eyes of a man who had decided at some point in his life that the effort of concealment was no longer worth the price. "There she is," Harlan said, and his voice was the voice of a man who had once filled rooms, though illness had eroded its edges. "Sit down, Miss Brooks, and let me look at you." Charlotte sat. She let him look. This was one of the first things she had learned in nursing, that patients needed to assess you before they could trust you, and that the most useful thing you could do in those first minutes was simply be still and let yourself be seen. "You're young," Harlan said, not critically. "I'm competent," Charlotte replied, not defensively. Harlan looked at Cecil in the doorway, and something passed between father and son that Charlotte could not fully read. Then Harlan smiled at her, a broad, open thing that transformed his gaunt face. "I like her already," he announced. "She can stay." Cecil said nothing. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer, his shoulder against the frame, and then he turned and went back down the hall, and Charlotte heard the front door open and close with careful, deliberate quietness. She turned her attention entirely to her patient, because that was her purpose here, and she had always been a woman who honored her purpose. Harlan Ford's condition was more serious than the telegram had suggested, as was nearly always the case when men described their own illnesses or the illnesses of those they loved. The rheumatic complications were real. His joints were swollen and stiff, and he moved with the careful economy of a man who has mapped every pain in his body and learned to root around it. But the chest ailment was what concerned Charlotte most. She could hear, when she pressed her ear to the stethoscope Dr. Hale had given her on the occasion of her first independent assignment, a wet, irregular sound in Harlan's left lung that told her his heart was working harder than it should and not managing the effort with any efficiency. She said nothing of this to Harlan immediately. She asked him questions instead, about his history, his habits, the timeline of his symptoms. She watched his color and his breathing, and the way his fingers sometimes trembled when he reached for his water glass. She took note of everything. She was still taking notes in her small leather journal when Cecil knocked on the open door at sundown to say that supper was on the table. She had not expected him to cook. This surprised her, and she must have shown it, because something that was nearly amusement passed across Cecil's face as he turned back toward the kitchen. "My mother died when I was 12, he said without looking at her. "There were things that needed doing. I learned to do them." They ate supper together, the three of them, and Charlotte learned more in that meal about the Ford family than she might have from 3 days of conversation. Harlan talked enough for two men, telling stories about the ranch's early years and the cattle drives he'd ridden in the 1860s when the Kishom Trail was young, and the buffalo were still plentiful enough that you could ride through a herd for a day and not see the end of it. He talked about his wife, Ailing, with a soft and unhurried grief that suggested her loss was still present in the house, woven into the walls and the faded curtains and the quilt on the settee. Cecil ate with methodical care and said almost nothing. He responded when his father addressed him directly, and he made sure Charlotte's plate was full and her water glass replenished. But these attentions were performed with the quiet efficiency of habit rather than courtship, and Charlotte noticed the difference. She also noticed that when he thought neither of them was watching, he watched his father with an expression of such contained and private anguish that it made her chest ache. He loved his father deeply. That was the first real thing she understood about Cecil Ford. After supper, when she was washing the dishes and Harlan had been helped back to bed, Cecil appeared beside her at the basin and began to dry the plates without asking. They stood in a silence that should have been awkward and was instead strangely ordinary, the oil lamp throwing warm light across the kitchen and the wind finding the gaps around the window frame and whistling softly through them. "How bad is he?" Cecil asked. Charlotte considered the question. She considered Cecil's profile, the tight line of his jaw, the way he was holding the dish towel as though the act of wringing it gave him something to do with the tension in his hands. "His heart is struggling," she said. She believed in honesty with the families of patients, delivered with care but without false comfort, because false comfort was a cruelty dressed as kindness, and she had seen what it cost people in the end. The rheumatic fever he had years ago left scarring on the valves. That's what's causing the chest problems and the weakness. It's not something that will be cured, Mr. Ford, but it can be managed and he can be made more comfortable, and with the right care, the progression can be slowed considerably. Cecil was very still for a moment. "Can it be reversed?" he asked. "No," Charlotte said gently. "I'm sorry." He nodded once, a single precise movement, and then he went on drying the plates, and Charlotte went on washing them, and neither of them spoke again until the last dish was done, and the lamp was turned down low, and they said good night with the careful formality of strangers who are beginning, despite everything, to feel less like strangers. The days settled into a rhythm that was both demanding and quietly satisfying. Charlotte's mornings began before sunrise, checking Harlan's vitals and administering the digitalis she had prescribed to support his heart function, a medication she'd sent for through the pharmacy in Wichita, one of the most reliable in the territory at that time. She prepared his breakfast soft foods, easily digestible, nothing that would tax his diminished system, and sat with him while he ate, listening to his stories, asking him questions, letting him feel that his history mattered and that someone was genuinely interested in hearing it. Because she was. Harlan Ford was a genuinely remarkable man, and Charlotte had learned to find the remarkable in people regardless of their circumstances, because it was always there if you were willing to look. In the afternoons, while Harlan napped, Charlotte would step outside into the Kansas air and do what she privately called her thinking walk circuits around the ranch yard and out along the fence line, her eyes on the broad sweep of the plains and the enormous sky that made everything beneath it feel simultaneously insignificant and precious. It was during these walks that she began to notice Cecil. Not that she could easily avoid noticing Cecil Ford. He was a physical presence that the ranch seemed to organize itself around. Where he stood, other things aligned. She watched him work with the horses, which he did with a patience and attentiveness that she found almost startling. She watched him mend fences and haul feed and negotiate with the two ranch hands he employed, a Mexican man named Alejandro and a younger man from Ohio named Peters who had come west the way many young men did in that era, chasing a version of themselves that hadn't yet been tested. Cecil treated both men with a straightforward respect that was neither easy familiarity nor condescension, and they worked well and hard for him, which Charlotte had observed was the truest measure of a man's character in the West. He noticed her noticing him. She was certain of it. But he made no reference to it, and she made no reference to it, and they continued their careful dance of proximity and restraint through the first week, and then the second. It was during the third week that the first crack appeared in the wall between them. Harlan had a difficult night, his breathing worsening in the small hours, his color going a shade of gray that sent Charlotte to his bedside with her stethoscope and her most controlled concern. She managed it, adjusted his position, administered a careful additional dose of his medication, sat with him through the worst of it until his breathing eased and the color began to return to his face. By the time the sun was a suggestion on the eastern horizon, Harlan was sleeping more peacefully, and Charlotte was sitting in the chair beside his bed, her own hands unsteady with the released tension of the night. She did not hear Cecil's door open. She did not hear him come down the hall. The first she knew he was there was when a cup of hot coffee appeared on the bedside table beside her, and she looked up to find him standing over her with an expression that she had no defenses prepared for, open and unguarded in a way she had not seen from him before, the careful control stripped away by sleeplessness and fear, and what remained was something raw and honest and achingly human. "I heard," he said quietly. "I was going to come in, but I could hear from the hall that you had it managed." He paused. "Thank you." Charlotte wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "This is what I'm here for," she said. "I know," Cecil said, "but it's still—" He stopped. He looked at his father's sleeping face. "He's all I have left," he said, and his voice was simple and unadorned and absolutely devastating. Charlotte felt something shift in her chest. She recognized it as the beginning of something she was not certain she should allow, but she had always believed that what the heart knows, it knows in advance of the mind's willingness to admit it, and her heart apparently had been paying attention for 3 weeks. "Sit down," she said softly. Cecil looked at her. "You've been awake all night worrying," she said. "Sit down and have some coffee with me. He's stable. You don't need to stand guard." He sat. He pulled the second chair from its place by the wall and positioned it near the window, where the first light of morning was just beginning to silver the glass, and he sat in it the way he sat in everything, with care, as though the act of occupying space was something he had considered and chosen deliberately. They sat in the quiet together as the morning came on, watching Harlan sleep, drinking coffee that Cecil had made strong enough to wake the dead, and Charlotte told him about what she had done during the night and what to watch for in the coming days, and Cecil listened with the focused attention of a man who is converting information into action, because action is the only language in which he is fully fluent. And at some point in there, something between them changed. She couldn't have named the precise moment. But when the sun was fully up and Harlan was stirring and the ranch was coming awake around them, and Charlotte stood from her chair and said she would go and make breakfast, Cecil stood too, and he looked at her for a moment with those October sky eyes and said, "Charlotte." It was the first time he had used her given name. "Yes," she said. "I'm glad you came," he said. And then he went to wake Peters and Alejandro for the morning's work, and Charlotte stood in his father's room holding her empty coffee cup and feeling the weight of 4 words settle into her like rain into dry ground. The trouble was that Cecil Ford was not a simple man, and the Double Arrow Ranch was not a simple place, and the longer Charlotte stayed, the more she felt the presence of something beneath the surface of ordinary life here, something with edges and weight that she could not quite see clearly enough to name. There were the locked drawers in the office Cecil kept off the main room. There were the occasional riders who came to the ranch at odd hours, men she was never formally introduced to, men who spoke with Cecil in the yard at a distance she could not bridge without appearing intrusive, and then rode off with the same unhurried purposefulness with which they had arrived. There was the telegram that arrived in the 4th week, which Cecil read in the kitchen with his back to her and then folded 4 times and put inside his shirt, the movement smooth and practiced and utterly involuntary. She was not a suspicious woman by nature. She was, by nature and by training, an observant one. These were different things, though they could look similar from the outside. She asked Harlan about it on a mild afternoon when he was feeling well enough to sit up and she was rubbing liniment into his swollen knuckles. "Your son," she said carefully. "What does he do? Beyond the ranch, I mean." Harlan was quiet for a moment, not evasive, she thought, but choosing. "Cecil has interests," Harlan said finally. "Business interests. There's a land deal he's been working on for the better part of 2 years. Section of the territory south of here that the railroad wants to route through. Worth a considerable amount of money if it comes together." He paused. "Cecil has always been the kind of man who builds towards something, even when it's slow going." "And the men who come by?" Charlotte asked. Harlan looked at her then, directly, the way he did when he wanted her to understand something he wasn't going to say all the way out loud. "Cecil has always had to be careful," Harlan said. "This is the frontier, Charlotte. Being careful sometimes looks like being secretive from the outside. That doesn't always mean it is." Charlotte filed this away. She was good at filing things away and returning to them when she had more information to set alongside them. The 4th week brought a rainstorm that confined everyone to the house for 3 days, and those 3 days did more to dissolve the distance between Charlotte and Cecil than the previous 3 weeks combined. There was something about being storm-bound together that stripped away the scaffolding of daily routine and left people simply present with one another. Cecil read, or tried to. She caught him 3 times with the same book open to the same page, his eyes somewhere that had nothing to do with the text. Charlotte worked on her medical notes and wrote letters to her colleague in St. Louis and taught Harlan a card game that she had learned from a traveling doctor who claimed to have learned it in New Orleans. On the 2nd night of the storm, Harlan fell asleep early, and Charlotte and Cecil found themselves alone in the main room with the fire and the rain and no particular reason to go to separate corners. Cecil made coffee. He always made the coffee, and Charlotte had come to suspect he might be the finest coffee maker between Kansas City and the Colorado Territory, and he brought 2 cups to the table and sat across from her, and for once did not immediately find something to occupy his hands. "Where are you from originally?" he asked. "Not St. Louis. Ohio," she said, surprised by the question. "A small town outside Columbus called Walnut Creek. My father was a doctor." "A real doctor, not a barber surgeon. He trained at Western Reserve." "Then medicine was always going to be your path," Cecil said. "Not exactly." She turned her coffee cup between her palms. "When I was 17, my father died of typhoid. The disease he had spent his career fighting took him in 3 weeks. My mother and we were left with the house, which was mortgaged, and the practice, which couldn't operate without him. I went to St. Louis because there was a program there for women nurses, and I thought," she stopped, "I thought if I learned enough, I could prevent what happened to him from happening to anyone else I cared about." Cecil was watching her with that steady attention that she had come to think of as one of his essential qualities. "Did it work?" he asked. "I've lost patience," she said honestly, "but I've saved more than I've lost. And I've learned that you can't prevent everything. You can only prepare yourself to face it." "That's a hard lesson," Cecil said. "Yes," she agreed. "What about you? Were you always going to be a rancher?" Something complex moved through his expression, and he was quiet long enough that she thought he might redirect the question, which was another thing she had observed about him, that he was entirely capable of the conversational equivalent of riding around a problem rather than through it. But then he said, "My father built this place. I've always known I'd take it over, but I've been trying to do something more with it. Something that would, he paused, and she sensed he was deciding how much to say. Something that would secure it, make it the kind of place that can stand for the next generation, not just survive the current one. The land deal, Charlotte said quietly. His eyes sharpened, just slightly, but she caught it. My father told you about it, he said. A little. Cecil was quiet for a moment, his thumbs moving against the surface of the table in a slow, unconscious rhythm. There's a lot riding on it, he said. More than just money. There are people involved who have expectations, and people who would prefer it fell apart. He met her eyes. It gets complicated. Most things worth doing do, Charlotte said. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire shifted and settled. The rain beat against the windows. And then Cecil Ford smiled, a real smile, not the controlled half-smile she had seen him produce in polite social situations, but something open and genuine and slightly rueful, as though he was acknowledging the accuracy of her observation and the pleasant surprise of finding it in her. And Charlotte felt her heart do something that was entirely outside her professional jurisdiction. She went to bed that night and lay listening to the rain, and had a very serious conversation with herself about the nature of her situation, and the importance of maintaining appropriate professional boundaries, and the inadvisability of developing complicated feelings for the son of her patient in the middle of an assignment in the wilds of Kansas. This conversation was thorough, well-reasoned, and entirely ineffective. By the beginning of the 5th week, she had stopped pretending she wasn't falling in love with Cecil Ford and started simply trying to figure out what to do about it. The letter changed everything. Not the one she had found by accident, there was another letter first. The one that arrived from the Kansas Territorial Nursing Society at the start of the 6th week, informing her that her assignment had been extended by 2 weeks at the request of the Ford family, and with the approval of Harlan's consulting physician in Wichita, and that she should expect to remain at the Double Arrow until the end of October. She had read this letter in the kitchen with the morning sun coming through the window, and she had thought two things simultaneously: that she was glad because Harlan genuinely needed her, and that she was frightened because every additional day she spent in this house was another day of falling that brought the ground closer. Cecil had come in from the yard to find her still holding the letter, and he had looked at it and then at her with a question in his eyes. "I'm staying 2 more weeks," she said. Something crossed his face, relief, she thought, though he corralled it quickly. "Harlan will be pleased," he said. "Yes," Charlotte agreed. And then, because she was her father's daughter and her father had always said that courage was just fear that had decided to be useful, she added, "Are you?" The question landed between them with all the weight she had put behind it. Cecil looked at her for a full, unhurried moment, his expression stripped of its usual careful management. "Yes," he said, and he turned and went back outside before either of them had to do anything about it. It was 3 days later that the letter fell from the Bible. Now she stood in Harlan's room while Cecil came through the front door, and the words of that letter burned in her mind. The arrangement, Prentice Doyle, the warning about coming to Caldwell. A trap, hidden motives, something coming to the Double Arrow that she did not yet understand. She had to decide quickly whether to confront him about it or to wait. She chose to wait. It was not cowardice, it was strategy. She needed more information before she could understand what the letter truly meant, and confronting Cecil without understanding what she was confronting risked pushing him into a defensive silence she might never break through. So when he appeared in the doorway of his father's room and said, "How is he tonight?" she answered with a clinical calmness she did not feel, and she noted that her own hands were steady even as her heart was anything but, and she thought that her training had prepared her for this too, even if it had never specifically named the scenario. "Resting well," she said. "His breathing has been easier today. I think the new dosing schedule is helping." Cecil nodded. He came to stand beside his father's bed, and he looked down at Harlan with that expression. She had learned to recognize the one that contained multitudes and showed none of them. "Good," he said softly. Charlotte gathered her notes and her medical bag and said she was going to the kitchen to prepare his evening medication, and she left the room with a steady step and a racing mind. In the kitchen, she put water on to boil, and she thought very hard about Prentice Doyle and arrangements and what kind of dark past a land deal in frontier Kansas might be built upon. It took her 2 more days to find out. Alejandro told her. Not intentionally. He was not the kind of man who shared other people's business, but he had been watching Charlotte for several weeks with a quiet, assessing attention that reminded her a little of Cecil. And on a Wednesday afternoon when Peters had ridden into town for supplies and Cecil was at the south fence line and Harlan was asleep, Alejandro was at the barn door sharpening a blade when Charlotte walked past and he said, without looking up from his work, "You should know about Doyle." Charlotte stopped. She looked at him. "Tell me," she said. Alejandro was a man of perhaps 45, weathered in the way that men are weathered by real work and real weather, with a dignity in his bearing that spoke of a life that had not always been just or kind, but had been lived with integrity nonetheless. He had come north from Texas 8 years ago for reasons he had never shared, and he had worked the double arrow with a loyalty that Cecil clearly trusted without ever requiring its demonstration. "Prentice Doyle is the man who has been trying to take this land for 3 years," Alejandro said. His voice was low and even. "He has partners in Abilene. Men with money from the east who want to buy up the trail land before the railroad commits its route. They have been pressuring Mr. Ford, the old man, for 2 years to sell. The old man refuses. He has always refused." He paused. "When Harlan got sick this past spring, Doyle saw his opportunity. He approached Cecil with a different kind of arrangement, not a sale but a partnership. Cecil pretending to agree while the deal was being structured, delaying long enough to file certain legal claims that would protect the land regardless of what Doyle tried next." He looked at her then, directly. "Cecil has been playing a very dangerous game, Miss Brooks, and Doyle is not a patient man." Charlotte was very still. "And the arrangement Cecil mentioned in his letter," she said carefully. "The one he said he could no longer guarantee." Alejandro's eyes sharpened. He said nothing for a moment, then, "You saw that letter." "It fell," she said. "I didn't mean to." He was quiet for a long time. The blade rested still in his hands. Finally he said, "Cecil had an agreement to draw Doyle to Caldwell on a specific date after the legal filings were complete. At that point the land would be legally protected and Doyle would have no claim, but the filings have been delayed. There was a problem with the county records office in Wichita." He paused. "If Doyle comes before the filings are complete, there is a possibility that he could force a legal maneuver that would leave the double arrow vulnerable. That is what Cecil is trying to prevent." "By telling Doyle not to come yet," Charlotte said. "Yes," she exhaled. "And the danger you mentioned." Alejandro looked at his blade. "Doyle has made it clear through intermediaries that men who stand between him and what he wants sometimes come to accidents." His voice was entirely flat. "Cecil knows this. He has known it for months. He has not told his father because Harlan's heart cannot take it." He paused. "He has not told you because—" He stopped. "Because what?" Charlotte asked. Alejandro looked up at her with an expression that was almost gentle. "Because you have made it considerably more difficult for him to think about anything clearly," he said. "And a man who cannot think clearly is a man who makes mistakes." Charlotte stood in the afternoon light processing this information. The betrayal she had feared was not what she had imagined it to be. The hidden motives were not directed at her. The trap was not one she was caught in, it was one Cecil was trying to dismantle before it could close around his father's legacy and his family's land. And he was carrying it entirely alone. She thought about the letter he had written to Doyle. She thought about the nights he spent pacing above her room. She thought about the careful, measured way he moved through the world, as though he had calculated the weight of every action and was always aware that one miscalculation could bring the whole structure down. She thought about the way he had looked at her across his father's bed the first night of the storm, the open and vulnerable expression that he had not quite managed to seal over fast enough, and she made a decision. She went and found Cecil at the south fence. He was mending a break in the wire, his back to her, and he heard her coming. She knew he did, because his shoulders shifted almost imperceptibly, but he didn't turn until she was close enough that turning was unavoidable. She saw his expression, process her face, her posture, the directness of her approach, and she watched him arrive at a conclusion before she had said a word. "Alejandro told you," he said. "No," she said. "The letter told me." Alejandro explained what the letter meant. Cecil looked past her toward the ranch house for a moment, and she saw something in his profile that was not anger. It was more like the exhaustion that comes from carrying a secret and then learning you don't have to anymore, which is a different kind of exhaustion, the kind that comes from release rather than accumulation. "I should have told you myself," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "You should have." He turned to face her fully, and she could see the lines around his eyes that weren't there 6 weeks ago, or maybe were, and she had only now learned to see them. He looked like a man who had been standing in a current for a very long time and had grown tired of pretending the water wasn't moving. "Charlotte," he stopped. His jaw worked. "I didn't want you to be part of this. It wasn't safe." "I'm already part of this," she said, and her voice was steady in the way it was when she was speaking something that was simply and irreversibly true. "I've been part of this since the day I arrived, whether you chose it or not. I'm here and your father is my patient, and if something happens to this ranch or to you, it affects him, which means it affects me, which means I needed to know." He looked at her for a long time. The late afternoon light was gold and low, the plains stretching out behind him in every direction, the wind moving through the dry grass with a sound like breathing. "I've been trying to keep everyone safe," he said, and there was something almost broken in his voice. "Since my mother died, since my father got sick, since Doyle started circling, I've been trying to hold all of it together and not let any of the pieces hit anyone I care about." The last 4 words fell between them like something he hadn't quite intended to say. Charlotte took a step toward him. She was not a woman who apologized for her feelings or shrank from them. That too was something her father had taught her, that the heart's truth deserved the same rigor and respect as any other truth. "Cecil," she said, "let someone help you." He looked at her, and the control he kept himself behind cracked along a hairline that she had been watching develop for 6 weeks, and in the moment before he gathered himself back together, she saw everything: the loneliness of being the one who holds things together, the grief of watching his father fail, the particular exhaustion of a man who has convinced himself that needing help is the same as failing, and underneath all of it, like something that had been there for a while and grown too large to deny, the unmistakable light of a man who has fallen in love with someone who appeared in his life when he was not looking for anything and now could not imagine looking away. "Charlotte," he said, and her name in his voice was entirely different from every other time he had said it, different in kind and in weight. "I know," she said softly. And then they were standing very close together in the golden afternoon, and Cecil Ford lifted one hand and very carefully tucked a strand of hair behind her ear that the Kansas wind had pulled loose, and his fingertips brushed her cheek with a tenderness that was entirely at odds with the controlled, measured man she had spent 6 weeks observing, and Charlotte's breath left her completely. "I am going to figure out the Doyle situation," he said. His voice was low and rough. "And when I do, I am going to tell you exactly how I feel about you, in proper terms with the proper time given to it." "I look forward to that," Charlotte said, and she was very glad her voice didn't shake. He dropped his hand. He stepped back. He picked up his wire tool and turned back to the fence, and Charlotte turned and walked back toward the house with her heart entirely elsewhere. And the Kansas evening gathered itself around the Double Arrow Ranch like a thing that understood the significance of what had just passed. The Doyle situation, as Cecil called it, came to a head 11 days later with rather less orderly timing than anyone had planned for. Charlotte was changing the dressing on a small cut on Harlan's hand. He had pulled himself up from bed without calling for help and caught his hand on a nail when she heard a horse in the yard, then 2 horses, then more. She looked out the window and counted 4 riders, and even from that distance she could see that these were not men who had come for peaceful purposes. Their posture said it plainly. The way men's postures in the West spoke a language that you learned to read if you wanted to survive. "Stay here," she said to Harlan. She said it the way she said everything, with a calm certainty that conveyed this was not a request. "Charlotte," Harlan's voice was sharp with worry. "Your heart cannot take agitation," she said firmly. "Stay in bed. I will handle this." She went out of the bedroom and through the main room and onto the front porch with the same steady step she used when approaching a difficult situation in a medical context, which was to say the step of a woman who has decided that the most useful thing she can do is not fall apart. Cecil was already in the yard. He had come from the barn, and he was standing with his thumbs in his belt, in a stance that Charlotte had come to recognize as his way of occupying ground, making it clear, through stillness and the particular quality of his attention, that this was his land and he was not moving. The man at the front of the riders was Prentice Doyle. Charlotte knew him immediately from the description Alejandro had given her, a man of perhaps 50, well-dressed in the way of men who want frontier people to understand that they come from money, with a face that had the practiced pleasantness of someone who considers warmth a tool. "Ford," Doyle said, swinging down from his horse with the air of a man who expects hospitality. "I came early. You said wait, but I've been patient long enough." "You should have waited," Cecil said. His voice was entirely level. "I heard there was a filing issue in Wichita," Doyle said. "I have friends who know about these things. I thought maybe I could help move it along." His smile was the kind that didn't reach the eyes. "We're partners after all." "We're not partners," Cecil said. "We were never partners." Doyle's smile didn't waver, but something behind it sharpened. "Now that's an interesting way to speak to a man who's been waiting 2 years to formalize an agreement." "There is no agreement to formalize," Cecil said, "because 2 weeks ago, through a different channel, those filings were completed. The Double Arrow is legally and entirely protected under the Homestead Improvements Clause, and any claim you've been building in those Abilene offices is worth precisely nothing." Charlotte saw it hit Doyle, and she saw the smile go entirely away. "That's not possible," Doyle said. "It's the truth," Cecil said. "You can verify it in Wichita. I'll wait while you do." The riders behind Doyle shifted. Charlotte looked at them with a careful assessment, armed men, ready to follow whatever signal their employer gave, but men who would calculate risk before acting on impulse, she thought, not rabid dogs. Hired hands doing hired work, and hired hands generally preferred to be paid rather than dead. "Cecil," Charlotte said, and her voice was clear and calm and cut through the charged air with precision. Cecil looked at her. Doyle looked at her. Everyone in the yard looked at her. "I believe everyone here understands the situation," she said, stepping to the edge of the porch. She spoke directly to Doyle, the way she spoke to difficult family members who were making a medical situation harder, acknowledging their presence without conceding to their pressure. "The legal matter has been resolved. There is nothing here for you. And I should mention that the man inside this house has a serious heart condition, and any disturbance significant enough to agitate him could have consequences that would be considered, by any court in the territory, highly unfortunate for whoever caused them." She let this settle for a moment, and she watched Doyle process it. "You're the nurse," he said. "I am," Charlotte said pleasantly, "and I keep very thorough medical records, including notes about visitors, their stated purposes, and the dates of their calls." It was, she reflected later, the medical equivalent of showing a card, but it was a good card, and it landed where she intended it to land. Doyle looked at Cecil for a long moment. Then he looked back at Charlotte with an expression that was not friendly but was at least rational. "You'll be hearing from my lawyers," he said to Cecil. "I expect so," Cecil said. "Good evening, Mr. Doyle." Doyle mounted his horse. His riders followed. They rode off at a pace that was deliberately unhurried, which was its own kind of message, but they rode off, and Cecil and Charlotte stood in the yard and watched them until they were nothing but dust on the Kansas horizon. Charlotte let out a very slow, very controlled breath. Cecil turned to look at her. He was pale under his tan, and his hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. "The filings," she said. "Are they actually complete?" "Got the confirmation 2 days ago," he said. "I was waiting for the right time to tell Doyle. He came to you before you could." "Yes." Charlotte stepped off the porch. She crossed the yard and stood in front of him, and she looked up at him with everything that had been building in her for 6 weeks, and she said, "You did it. It's done." Cecil looked at her, and the last of whatever armor he had been wearing dissolved with an almost audible sound. "It's done," he confirmed. "Good," Charlotte said, "because I believe you promised me a proper conversation." He looked at her for a long, still moment, and then he laughed, not a polite laugh, not a controlled laugh, but the real kind, the kind that comes from genuine surprised delight, and it transformed his face entirely, stripped 10 years from it, made him look like the man he might have been if life had not required so much of him so early. "I did promise you that," he said. "Then perhaps tonight," Charlotte said. "After supper, when your father is settled." "Tonight," Cecil agreed, and his voice was low and warm and full of everything he intended to say. They went inside together, and Charlotte went directly to Harlan's room to check on him, and Harlan was sitting up in bed with the expression of a man who has heard more than he was supposed to from a room he was told to stay in. "Well," Harlan said, "how is your pulse?" Charlotte asked. "Better than it's been in months," Harlan said, with absolute sincerity and a smile that crinkled his entire face. The conversation that evening was not what Charlotte had expected, because Cecil Ford, it turned out, was not a man who had spent 30 years being taciturn because he had nothing to say, but because he had been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for someone worth saying it to. They sat on the porch in the autumn evening, the stars enormous over the Kansas plain, and Cecil talked about the ranch and about the years since his mother died and about what he wanted to build here. Not just the land, not just the cattle, but something lasting, something with meaning, a life that was full rather than just functional. He talked about his father with a tenderness that made Charlotte's eyes sting. He talked about the loneliness of the last several years with a directness that cost him something, she could see, but that he offered freely because honesty, like everything else he did, was something he had decided to commit to entirely or not at all. And then he said, "I didn't plan for you, I want you to know that. I had convinced myself that the ranch was enough, that taking care of my father was enough, that the land deal and building the Double Arrow's future was enough." He paused. "And then you stepped off that buckboard with your medical bag and your determination and your absolutely infuriating habit of saying true things when I would have preferred comfortable ones, and He stopped. His jaw moved. "I don't have elegant words for it. I just know that the thought of you leaving at the end of this assignment is the most unacceptable thing I have encountered in 30 years of encountering unacceptable things." Charlotte looked at him in the starlight, at the strong and careful and deeply feeling man beside her, at everything he was and everything he was still becoming, and she thought about Ohio and St. Louis and the journey west, and all the assignments she had taken and what she had told herself they were for prevention, purpose, moving towards something. And she understood now, with the clarity that certain truths arrive with, that she had been moving toward this. Toward him. Toward a porch in Kansas under enormous stars, with a man who had finally decided to say out loud what his eyes had been saying for 6 weeks. "Then perhaps," she said, "you should think carefully about what you intend to do about that." "I intend to ask you," Cecil said, "if you would be willing to stay, not as my father's nurse, though he needs you and I am glad you are here for him, but as—" He stopped again, and she could see him choosing words with the care of someone who doesn't use many and needs these to be right. "I want to court you properly, Charlotte. I want the time that these things deserve. I want to do this in the way that honors what I think you are worth." He met her eyes. "If you're willing." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the prairie grass. The stars blazed overhead in their thousands, impartial and ancient and entirely indifferent to the human decisions being made beneath them, which was itself a kind of comfort. The reminder that the universe had survived a great deal and would survive this too, and that the smallness of human moments was also their sweetness. "I'm willing," she said. The autumn deepened, and the double arrow settled into a new version of itself. Doyle's lawyers sent a letter, as promised, but the legal filings held firm, and by mid-November the Ailing interests had turned their attention elsewhere, as money generally did when it found a door closed to it. The threat that had hung over the ranch dissipated like morning fog, leaving the air clear and the land unambiguously the Ford's own. Harlan improved. Not dramatically. His heart condition was not the kind of thing that reversed itself, and Charlotte held to her professional integrity about this, and said so plainly when Harlan himself, in a rare moment of wishful thinking, suggested he might be on the mend in some fundamental way. But the digitalis was working. The managed rest and diet were allowing his body to compensate more effectively for the heart's limitations, and he had color in his face that had not been there when Charlotte arrived, and he had stopped requiring Charlotte to remain within earshot through the night, which she considered a genuine marker of progress. He also made her feel, with remarkable and apparently effortless skill, entirely at home. Charlotte understood that Harlan Ford had wanted his son to find someone, and that he had perhaps had hopes from fairly early in her arrival, and that he was now in the position of watching those hopes materialize with the patient satisfaction of a man who had planted something and was watching it grow. He never pushed. He never made the situation awkward. He simply made room for her, in conversation, in the daily rhythms of the household. In the particular way he spoke of the ranch's future in terms that included her presence as a natural and welcome thing. Cecil courted her with the same methodical care with which he did everything, which turned out to be more romantic than Charlotte would have predicted. He brought her small things, a book of poetry he ordered from a shop in Wichita, chosen with an attention to what he knew of her tastes that spoke of months of paying attention, a small bottle of lavender water because he had noticed her adding dried lavender to Harlan's room for the calming effect, and he thought she might like some for herself. He rode with her on the weekends when Harlan was settled, and Peters was available to sit with the old man, showing her the sections of the ranch she hadn't yet seen, the creek that ran along the north property line, clear and cold and lined with cottonwood trees in their autumn colors, the high ground to the southeast where on clear days you could see 30 miles in every direction, the small rise where Ailing Ford was buried, marked with a plain limestone headstone and surrounded by the wild prairie flowers that his mother had loved. He told her about Ailing as they stood at the grave, his voice measured and quiet and full of a love that had survived both loss and time. Charlotte listened and thought that a man who loved his mother the way Cecil Ford clearly would love a wife the way most women could only hope to be loved. In November, on a cold, clear afternoon when the Kansas sky was the color of polished pewter, and the prairie was going the deep amber of late autumn, Cecil kissed her for the first time. They had been walking along the creek line, their breath visible in the air, and they had stopped to watch a pair of geese pass overhead in their southward journey, and in the moment after the geese disappeared and the silence settled back around them, Cecil turned to her and looked at her for one long moment and then leaned down and kissed her with a gentleness and a restraint that contained, she was certain, considerably more than it expressed, which was itself one of the most compelling things about it. She kissed him back without restraint. He made a sound that was almost surprised, and then he kissed her again, and the Kansas wind went on blowing and the cottonwoods rattled their last leaves overhead, and Charlotte Brooks felt, with absolute certainty, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. December arrived. Charlotte's assignment, extended twice by this point, was technically concluded, and she knew she needed to make a decision about her future in explicit terms rather than implicit ones. The Kansas Territorial Nursing Society had 2 other assignments waiting for her, and she had obligations and professional relationships and a life that existed outside of this ranch, and all of this needed to be addressed clearly rather than sidestepped. She had this conversation with herself at night, lying in the small room that had become familiar and dear to her, listening to the wind and the particular nighttime sounds of the ranch. She had it with complete honesty, asking herself the hard questions that she would have asked any patient making a significant life decision. What do you actually want? What are you afraid of? What would you regret? What do you owe yourself and what do you owe others? And which of those answers are based on truth and which on fear? At the end of this conversation, which took several nights and produced a great deal of journal writing, she had a clear answer on every count. She went to find Cecil on a Sunday morning in early December, before the week could start, and before the daily business of the ranch could make private conversations feel stolen. He was at the barn, as he often was in the early mornings, checking on the horses with the quiet attentiveness that was characteristic of him. She came into the barn and he looked up and she said, "I need to talk to you." He set down the brush he was holding. Something moved through his eyes, a shadow of anticipation, she thought, the knowledge that this was a conversation that would determine something significant. "All right," he said. "My assignment here is finished," she said. "I have other commitments. And I need to know." She stopped. She gathered herself, the way she always did when something important needed to be said without decoration. "I need to know what this is, Cecil. We are, what you intend, because I cannot make my plans on assumptions and I will not stay here indefinitely without knowing where I stand." Cecil looked at her for a moment, and then he took 2 steps toward her and stopped, and he said, "I had a different plan for how this would happen. I was going to wait until spring when the ranch is prettier and the weather cooperates and the timing felt right." He paused. "But you're right, and you're more important than a plan." He reached into his coat pocket. He produced a ring, a simple gold band with a small oval stone that she recognized as garnet, dark red and clear in the winter light that came through the barn's open door. "This was my mother's," he said. "She told my father when she gave it to him before she passed that he should give it to whoever Cecil chose when he finally chose. She said she trusted his judgment." His voice was careful and steady and entirely serious. "Charlotte Brooks, I love you. I have loved you since approximately the 3rd day you were here, though I spent several weeks being extremely unreasonable about admitting it. You are the most competent, most honest, most genuinely courageous person I have encountered in my life, and I would like, if you are willing, to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you." He paused. "Will you marry me?" Charlotte looked at the ring and at his face, and at 30 years of carefully managed self-sufficiency turned, at this moment, into something entirely open and offered without reservation. "Yes," she said, "I will." He put the ring on her finger. It fit almost perfectly, as though Cecil Ford had known. And then he pulled her into his arms with the particular quality of embrace of a man who has been holding himself carefully apart for a long time and has just stopped. And Charlotte put her face against his chest and felt his heart beating under her ear, strong, regular, reliable, and thought that she had spent her entire career listening to people's hearts, and that this was the one she had been listening for. They were married in March of 1879 in the Caldwell Methodist Church, on a morning that was cold and bright, the sky that particular brilliant blue that only Kansas produces in early spring, as though the sky itself was making an effort. Harlan Ford sat in the front pew in his best suit, which Charlotte had brushed and pressed the night before, and he wept openly and without apology during the ceremony, which Charlotte found entirely endearing. Alejandro and Peter stood as witnesses. The minister was a small, serious man named Reverend Cobb, who conducted the ceremony with a brevity and solemnity that felt appropriate to the magnitude of the occasion. Cecil said his vows in a low, steady voice with his eyes on Charlotte's face throughout, as though he wanted her to understand that the words were directed at her specifically and not at the general universe. Charlotte said hers with the same clear simplicity that characterized everything she did, directly, without performance, meaning every syllable. They had a small supper at the ranch house afterward. Harlan told 3 stories about Cecil's childhood that made everyone at the table laugh, including Cecil, who had the expression of a man who has accepted the inevitability of certain embarrassments and found peace with them. Charlotte sat beside her husband and felt the warmth of his hand over hers on the table, and thought that happiness had a different texture than she had imagined. It would less dramatic, more ordinary, and precisely because of its ordinariness, more sustaining. Late that night, when the guests had gone and Harlan was sleeping and the ranch house was quiet, Charlotte and Cecil sat by the fire together, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her, the way they would sit 10,000 more times in the years to come. "I have something to tell you," Cecil said. Charlotte looked up. His expression was warm and private and a little amused. "I was terrified," he said. "Of what?" "Of all of it," he considered. "When my father's illness got serious, I convinced myself that everything I needed to do was practical: manage the land deal, find good medical care for him, hold the ranch together. I made a very thorough list of things to manage." A pause. "You were not on the list," Charlotte smiled. "How unfortunate for your list." "Catastrophic for it, really," Cecil agreed, and he pressed a kiss to the top of her head with an ease and naturalness that felt like it had always been true. The year that followed was one of building. Charlotte wrote to the Kansas Territorial Nursing Society to terminate her membership, a decision she made without regret, and instead established a small medical practice out of the ranch house. Not officially, not with a doctor's credentials she didn't have, but as a skilled nurse available to the ranching families in the surrounding area who had nowhere else to turn for basic medical care. Word spread, as it always did in frontier communities, and within a few months she had a steady stream of patients and an arrangement with the physician in Wichita to consult by post on cases that required a doctor's input. Cecil watched this with an admiration he expressed practically rather than verbally, building her a proper examination room off the back of the house, well lit and cleanly finished, with a lockable cabinet for her medications, and a proper examination table that a carpenter in Caldwell made to her specifications. It was, Charlotte thought, the most romantic thing he had ever done. Harlan remained stable through the spring and summer, and Charlotte monitored him with the careful, affectionate attention of a nurse who had also become a daughter-in-law, and who understood that these 2 roles required exactly the same things from her: honesty, consistency, presence, and the willingness to say hard truths gently. Harlan thrived under it. He was not well. In the way of men with serious cardiac conditions, he would never be truly well, but he was present and engaged and full of opinion and story, and Charlotte considered this an excellent outcome. In August of 1879, Charlotte told Cecil she was pregnant. She told him in the examination room, sitting across from each other on the 2 chairs she kept there for patient conversations, because she was a woman who approached significant news with a certain structural formality, and also because she had been sitting in this chair when she had confirmed it to herself, and it seemed right to share it in the same place. Cecil was very still for a moment. Then he stood up, and he crossed to where she sat, and he went down on one knee in front of her chair and took her hands in both of his, and looked at her with an expression that she had never seen on his face before and could not have predicted: something vast and stunned and deeply, privately grateful, as though he was in the presence of something he had not dared to hope for. "Are you all right?" he asked. It was the first thing he said, and it was characteristic that this was the first thing. "I'm perfectly well," she said, smiling. "This is not an illness." "No," he said. He squeezed her hands. "No, it is most certainly not." And he laughed, that real laugh, the one she loved, and pulled her forward and held her with the careful strength of a man who is holding the most important thing he has been given. They told Harlan that evening. The old man sat in his chair by the window and received the news with a silence that lasted long enough that Charlotte reached for his pulse automatically. Then he looked at both of them with eyes that were bright with something that went beyond happiness, something that was closer to completion. "Eleanor would have loved you," he said to Charlotte. It was the most direct thing he had ever said to her, and it cost him something to say it, and it meant more than a very long speech would have. "I know," Charlotte said simply. "I would have loved her too." Their son was born in April of 1880, in the same room where Harlan Ford slept, because Charlotte had decided with characteristic practicality that she was not going to have a child in a room she couldn't fully control the conditions of, and the bedroom was the cleanest and best-lit room in the house. Cecil was present throughout, which was not common practice for the era but was not something Charlotte was willing to negotiate. And he was, as she had expected, because by now she knew him as well as she knew herself, precisely the person she needed beside her, steady, present, entirely focused on her. The baby arrived just before dawn, healthy and indignant about it, with the full dark hair of his grandfather and what appeared to be, Charlotte thought with tired amusement, the set jaw of his father. "What do we call him?" Cecil asked, looking at his son with an expression that was helpless and adoring and entirely unguarded. Charlotte looked at her husband and then at the child and then at the doorway, where Harlan had appeared in his nightclothes, steadying himself with one hand on the frame and wearing an expression of joy so uncontained it made the room feel larger. "I thought Harlan James Ford," Charlotte said. "If you're agreed." Cecil looked at his father. Harlan made a sound that was not technically a word and pressed his hand over his mouth and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "I'm agreed," Cecil said. His voice was rough. Harlan James Ford came into the world in the manner of all Fords at the Double Arrow Ranch, with his family gathered close, which was where he stayed for the rest of a long and happy life. Harlan Sr. lived 2 more years. Charlotte had always known, in the honest part of herself that she kept separate from hope, that this was likely the time frame the condition allowed. He did not suffer at the end. She saw to that with the same careful competence she had brought to everything she did, managing his final weeks with the goal of dignity and peace, making sure that he was comfortable and surrounded by the people he loved, and that he understood, clearly and repeatedly, what those people felt for him. He died on a September morning in 1882, in the room where the morning light came in, with Charlotte on one side and Cecil on the other and little Harlan James, 2 years old and solemn-faced, sitting on the bed between them without understanding and somehow, with the unnerving instinct of children, understanding entirely. Cecil bore his father's death the way he bore everything, quietly, with enormous depth and very little surface, the grief contained within him and processed in the private hours, in the long rides over his father's land that Charlotte watched him take and understood the purpose of. She did not try to circumvent his grief or accelerate it or redirect it. She simply stayed beside it, present and patient, the way she had learned that the most important thing you can do for someone in pain is simply not leave. One evening, about 3 weeks after Harlan's burial, Cecil came in from a long afternoon ride to find Charlotte at the kitchen table writing letters, and he sat down across from her and was quiet for a while, and then he said, he was happy at the end, genuinely happy, because of you. Charlotte set her pen down. She looked at him. "Because of you," she said, "because of your son, because of this place he loved." "Because you stayed," Cecil said. "You could have left after the assignment ended. You could have taken those other positions and had a very different life, and instead," he stopped. "And instead I'm here," Charlotte said. "And instead you're here," Cecil agreed, and he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and they sat in the kitchen that smelled of coffee and wood smoke and the particular warmth of a home that is fully inhabited by love, and the Kansas evening settled around the Double Arrow Ranch, which was theirs, which was whole, which was going to last. In the years that followed, the Double Arrow grew. Cecil's land filings and his careful management of the ranch's finances through the late 1870s had positioned the operation well, and as the 1880s brought more stability to the Kansas frontier, the worst of the violence subsiding, the railroad cementing its roots, the legal structures of territorial law becoming more reliable, the ranch expanded. Cecil negotiated wisely. He hired carefully. He built the kind of operation that his father had dreamed of and that he had spent his young adult life working toward. And Charlotte built her practice. The examination room off the back of the house became a source of genuine medical care for the surrounding community ranching families, the growing town of Caldwell itself, the occasional traveler who arrived in need of skilled attention. She corresponded regularly with physicians in Wichita and Kansas City, keeping herself current in a field that was advancing more rapidly than most people on the frontier realized. She assisted in surgeries when a doctor rode out from the city. She trained 2 younger women in basic nursing skills, passing on what she had learned the way her father had taught her to pass things on generously, without withholding. In 1884, Charlotte and Cecil's second child arrived, a daughter they named Ailing, who came into the world with her grandmother's name and proceeded, as the years made clear, to earn it in every way that mattered. Ailing was dark-eyed and determined and laughed easily and chose her battles with a precision that Cecil found simultaneously exhausting and deeply gratifying. Young Harlan, by this point 4 years old, received his sister with the solemn importance of a firstborn son who has been informed of his responsibilities and intends to take them seriously. He showed her his rock collection, his best rope, and the cottonwood near the creek that he had claimed as his personal climbing tree, and Charlotte watched this and thought that whatever she and Cecil were building here, it was working. It was real. It was the kind of thing that lasted. Alejandro retired from the ranch work in 1885, his knees and his back having given notice before he did. Cecil and Charlotte gave him a comfortable portion of the property near the creek, where he built a small house and kept a garden and lived out his years with the dignity he had always carried, and now had the time to inhabit fully. He had supper at the ranch house every Sunday without fail, and told the children stories about the early years of the Double Arrow that made the place feel mythological and immediate at once. Peters, the young man from Ohio who had been 20 when Charlotte arrived, married a woman from Caldwell named Rachel and settled in town, and his children and the Ford children grew up in the particular friendship that comes from proximity and shared roots, and the knowledge that your family's histories are woven together in ways too old and deep to require explanation. There was an evening in the autumn of 1886, 8 years after Charlotte had stepped off a buckboard with her medical bag into a life she could not have planned, when she and Cecil sat on the porch of the Double Arrow Ranch house and watched their 2 children playing in the last gold light of the evening. Young Harlan, 6 years old, was attempting to demonstrate a rope trick he had been practicing for 2 weeks, with more ambition than success. Ailing, 2 years old and entirely unconcerned with rope tricks, was investigating a grasshopper in the dry grass with a focused scientific interest that made Charlotte smile. Cecil had his arm around his wife's shoulders. The plains stretched out in every direction, enormous and familiar, the same plains that had seemed so vast and unknowable to Charlotte 8 years ago and now felt like home in the deepest sense of the word, not just familiar but formative, the landscape that had shaped her as much as she had shaped herself. "Are you happy?" Cecil asked. It was not a question he asked frequently. He was not a man who trafficked in sentiment for its own sake. When he asked, he meant it to be answered directly. Charlotte considered it the way she had always considered important questions, fully, honestly, without sentimentality but without false modesty either. "Yes," she said, "entirely." He looked at her, and she looked at him, and between them was 8 years of shared mornings and difficult nights, and the particular intimacy of people who have seen each other at their best and their worst and chosen to stay. And she thought that this was love at its most complete. Not the dazzling early fall of it, not the dramatic moments that made stories worth telling, but the daily chosen thing, the presence that anchors you. The person who knows your voice in the dark and can tell by the way you carry your shoulders what kind of day you've had and reaches for your hand without being asked. "I need to tell you something," Cecil said. Charlotte felt a flicker of the old alertness, her nurse's instinct for reading shifts in tone. "What is it?" she asked. "I'm happy too," he said, and his voice was simple and direct and entirely without performance. "I want you to know that. I was not a man who expected to be. And you," he paused, and the controlled man who had chosen every word with care for 30 years was, in this moment, unguarded in the way she had learned to love most deeply. "You made it possible. You stayed when you could have gone. You helped when you didn't have to. You loved me when I was, by any reasonable assessment, not easy to love." "You were not difficult to love," Charlotte said. "You were only difficult to reach. That is a different thing." He looked at her for a long moment. "I thank God every day," he said quietly, "that you were stubborn enough to reach." Charlotte laughed, which was perhaps not the most dignified response to a declaration of that quality, but it was an honest one, and honesty had always been the foundation of everything between them, the bedrock that made all the rest possible. She leaned into his side, and he pulled her closer, and they sat on the porch of the Double Arrow Ranch in the autumn evening with their children's voices carrying through the clear air, and the vast Kansas sky overhead going the colors of fire and gold, and the particular deep rose of the western horizon at the end of a clear day, and the plains stretching out all around them, enormous and patient and enduring, the way the land endures through drought and storm, through the seasons turning, through the quiet accumulation of years lived well and love given freely, and a life built, board by board and day by day and choice by choice, into something that would stand. Young Harlan finally managed the rope trick. He held it up triumphantly, looking to his parents for confirmation. Cecil applauded with genuine pride. Charlotte called out, "Well done." Eleanor looked up from her grasshopper long enough to evaluate her brother's achievement and then returned to her investigation, apparently finding the scientific question of greater pressing importance. "She's going to be a doctor," Cecil said. "She's going to be whatever she decides," Charlotte said. "That too," Cecil agreed, and he smiled. And it was the smile she had first seen in a Kansas kitchen in the rain, the real one, the open one, the one that had started the end of a very careful man's long project of keeping the world at a safe distance. The evening deepened around the Double Arrow Ranch. The children came in from the yard, their faces bright with the uncomplicated happiness of children who have been loved well and don't know yet that this is not universal. Supper was made and eaten around the table that had once held the silence of a man carrying too much alone. The lamps were lit. The dishes were washed, the two of them standing together at the basin the way they had stood together on Charlotte's third day at the ranch, except that now the silence between them was not careful or distant but easy and warm, and full of the accumulated knowledge of people who know each other deeply and find, in that knowing, only more reason to stay. The children were put to bed. The ranch house settled into its nighttime quiet. And Charlotte and Cecil Ford sat by the fire in the front room where Eleanor Ford's faded curtains had long since been replaced, and the quilt on the settee was new and full of color. And they were, in the fullest sense of the word, home. "Do you remember the letter?" Charlotte asked after a while. Cecil looked at her. "The one that fell from the Bible," she said. "I remember," he said. "I was terrified when I read it," she said. "I thought you had been lying to me, that there was something dark underneath what I thought I knew." She paused. "It took me a moment to realize that the lie you were protecting was not yours." "I should have told you," Cecil said. "About Doyle, about all of it." "Yes," she said. "You should have." She smiled. "But you were trying to protect everyone. That is who you are. You don't outgrow that. You just learn to include someone else in what you're protecting." Cecil looked at her with the expression that was, for her, his truest face, the one that was present and open and entirely without defense. "I include you in everything now," he said. "If you haven't noticed." "I've noticed," Charlotte said, and she meant it in every possible way. Outside, the Kansas night was enormous and clear and full of stars, the same stars that had been overhead on the creek bank when he had first kissed her, on the porch when he had first declared himself, over the church in Caldwell on the morning that had begun the rest of their lives. The same stars that had been overhead when Harlan Ford drew his last breath in the morning light, and when Harlan James Ford took his first, and when Eleanor Ford opened her dark eyes on the world and apparently immediately began planning to study everything in it. The Double Arrow Ranch stood on the Kansas plain the way it would stand for generations, solid and certain, built by a man who had loved his land and raised a son who loved it better, and tended by a woman who had arrived with a medical bag and a professional purpose, and had found, in the process of saving one man's life, the whole of her own. Charlotte Brooks had come to nurse an ailing man. The son had not been able to keep his distance for long, and the world that grew up between them, the morning coffee and the fence lines, and the sound of children's voices in the yard, and the particular way he said her name when he thought no one was listening, and the particular way she reached for his hand in the dark, and the years that accumulated around them like rings inside a tree, quiet evidence of time, survived and rooted and continuously growing. This world was not something that required distance anymore. It was, simply and completely and forever, home.